World History, Chapter 3, Discussion number 6, sixth and final video on this chapter. Now we're getting away from Egypt and Nubia and getting into greater sub-Saharan Africa. So in Chapter 2, we talked about the Indo-European migrations from southern Russia to India, Iran, Turkey, and all over Europe. Well, a very similar migration happened in sub-Saharan Africa from the Niger-Congo region all through sub-Saharan Africa, and that was the Bantu migrations. So the Bantu speakers occupied the Niger-Congo region around 4000 BCE in modern Nigeria and Cameroon. They traveled along rivers and canoes and traded with the local pygmies or forest people, cultivating yams and palms plus goats. They traded pottery and stone axes for meat, honey, and forest products. But then, after about 1000 BCE, population pressures forced these people to spread south and east. Like the Indo-European migrations, though, the Bantu migrations were a gradual process. It took about 1,500 years, from about 1000 BCE to 500 CE, for the Bantus to get all the way from their homeland to everywhere else in sub-Saharan Africa. And so this is a long process. There are over 500 different but related Bantu languages spoken today by hundreds of millions of people. Again, Africa is huge. It's about 4 times the size of the United States, and even just sub-Saharan Africa is 2.5, 3 times the size of the United States. We're talking about a massive region of the world with very diverse peoples. One of the things I found interesting in this chapter is that the Bantu peoples largely displaced the local pygmies and kind of just dominated, although also a lot of the local forest dwellers would just trade and even intermarry and adapt into Bantu culture. They lived in communities of a few hundred individuals led by a chief, generally speaking. And there were age sets and age grades, followed by initiation rites into adulthood. Men were cultivators and provided military service, and women did duties and traded in markets. One of the things that I find really interesting about these Bantu speakers also, though, is that they were monotheists, believed in just one god, all the way since about 5000 BCE. A single impersonal deity who is the force of both good and evil, named Nyemba. He created the world, stepped back, and let the world proceed on its own. And there were a lot of prayers to ancestral spirits to bring good fortunes, but neglect could bring bad fortunes. But then you have this thing called cultural diffusion, and after about 1000 BCE, and many Bantu people interacting with Sudanic people from this region of the southern Sahara, they started to see Nyamba, their one god, as only a force of good. So now I'm going to go to the big map. Actually, first I'm going to go to the timeline, just to show how this interacts. We didn't talk much about Nok. It was briefly mentioned in the textbook. Nok culture from about 1500 to about 300 BCE, largely left out of this. Chapter 18 will be all about sub-Saharan Africa. This chapter was mostly about Egypt and Nubia, aka Kush. But you have Nok culture, and that eventually will lead, once you get into the CE years, post 700, we'll study all these in chapter 18. Some of these kingdoms such as Ghana and Mali. Mali was the richest empire in the world in the 1200 CE. I'm getting way ahead of myself. But you can see that you got sub-Saharan African societies, and these lines are the Bantu migrations. There's the ones we were studying alongside of Egypt, the Nubians with Kerma and the Kushites, and they're absorbed into the Axumites. But the other ones going down this line, the Nok culture, which then, like I say, drops into the Ghana and the Mali and the Songhai empires. We're going to get into that much, much later. But basically, those are your kingdoms of sub-Saharan Africa on the timeline, and I know I love maps. I'm kind of a maps addict. And I'll give you some trivia in a minute about Madagascar to close this out. But we are talking about the area around Nigeria and southern Cameroon. This is the Bantu homeland, Gulf of Guinea. Like I say, when we talked about the Phoenicians, they traded as far north as England and as far south as the Gulf of Guinea. They were quite some sailors. Nothing to do with the Bantus, but I'm trying to connect the dots here. Bantus spread out, especially after about 1000 BCE, and they head this way eastward and they head this way southward until they occupy all of Africa south of the Sahara, and later will form a lot of the big kingdoms that we'll study in chapter 18, such as the Kingdom of the Congo and drawing a blank on the Mali Empire, which is not in the modern country of Mali so much as over here. We're going to get into all of that, and then you have kingdoms over here, such as Great Zimbabwe, and also not entirely in modern Zimbabwe. That's all chapter 18. But basically, these are the Bantu migrations. And then the Sudan is the country of Sudan, but it's also this whole region on the southern edge of the Sahara where Africa transitions in a brief savanna zone from harsh desert to tropical forests. And so basically, I know I said Madagascar. So Madagascar is not Bantu. We're going to get into this group in chapter 6. Madagascar is Micronesian from Papua New Guinea. Most of those migrations are out into the Pacific Islands. That's going to be a really cool chapter. But there was one group of Micronesians that went west through the Indian Ocean, settled Madagascar, I believe about 200 BCE, and brought bananas to Madagascar, which then came over to mainland Africa and greatly enriched the Bantu people's diets. That's a pretty cool piece of history. So basically, to sum it all up, this chapter was mostly about Egypt and Nubia and the kingdom of Kush, and then the very end about the Bantu migrations, but how Egypt not only connected all these Mediterranean and Middle Eastern societies, but also connected to sub-Saharan Africa through the Nile Valley. So a lot of cool stuff in there, and just fun geography, history, and trivia, and that will wrap it for Chapter 3, World History Discussions. What do you all think of all of this? And finally, when we get to Chapter 4, that is going to be on India. Well, starting with Pakistan, modern Pakistan in the Indus Valley, and then leading to one of the Indo-European migrations, the Indo-Aryans, down into India, bringing the Vedic texts and the beginnings of Hinduism with them. That's next. But cool, a lot to be excited about. Woohoo!